I am going to both emphasize what the first two speakers talked about and hopefully give a somewhat different perspective, because I've seen it now both as a member of APS and on the Hill for various, there we go, advocacy days. So next week, for instance, I mean, you heard from my introduction, I'm at the Plasma Physics Laboratory at Princeton. Next week is Fusion Day. And so every year the fusion community goes onto the Hill and does the ask that we heard from both speakers. But since 2016, I've been a member of the General Assembly. And I suppose you can argue, certainly in this political climate, that there's significant opportunity to be effective and get things done at the state and local level, as Alan mentioned, and critically important. And so my takeaway message is, as both speakers said before me, get involved quickly, and if not us, something that John said when we talk about the politicization of science, but if not us advocating for science, then who will? So let me start. So this is the first plot that got me involved on my little trail from scientist, legislator. If you're in the world of fusion, you may know this already, but I came out of grad school, was a Oak Ridge postdoc, was at Princeton, went around a couple different places, came back to Princeton about 20 years ago and haven't left. But so this is a plot of projected funding from 1976 for fusion, and what sort of funding might look like to when we could get to completing and actually have a reactor. So there was maximum, accelerated, aggressive, moderate. This was plotted in 1976 as fusion never, and this is actual funding. And so to someone who asked before about how do you have policies that go through administrations, you can see that the funding for fusion is clearly doesn't care about Democrat or Republican. I will say, for reasons that have nothing to do with science, knowledge, or anything else, funding for fusion is up in the Trump administration, but it's completely decoupled from any results that we may have. But this was a frustration that led to running for office, and as Alan mentioned, I ran for Congress in 2014. I did that for a bunch of different reasons. That frustration was the first one. I was, as I said, frustrated with the gridlock and the anti-science attitude. We're scientists. We think we can do anything and everything better than anyone, right? We are sometimes criticized for being arrogant, but I thought I could do better as we were messing around with this whole idea. One of my campaign slogans was going to be, vote for me, I couldn't do any worse. We skipped that one. But as John mentioned also, there have been 3 PhD physicists in Congress, 1 Republican, Vern Ehlers, 2 Democrats, Rush Holt, and the current one, Bill Foster. Before Rush he's currently CEO of the AAAS, but before he was an 8-term member of Congress, he's assistant director at the Plasma Physics Laboratory. He actually hired me before he was even in Congress. So when he retired, if you've been to Princeton, you may have seen the bumper sticker, my congressman is a rocket scientist. We know technically plasma physics is not rocket science, that doesn't matter. I offered to put a Sharpie and said my congressman is still a rocket scientist. I lost the congressional race. I was up against people. I've never run for anything. I was also a past chair of the Forum on Physics and Society. I had won physics elections, but I'd never run for anything in my entire life. It was an amazing experience. I lost less worse than anyone imagined. That's another line that we like to use. If you have no name recognition and no money, and I had neither, you might get 1%, maybe 1.5% of the vote, just because people vote randomly. I got almost 8% of the vote. So that opened a lot of people's eyes. I ran for the New Jersey State Legislature, the lower house, the General Assembly in 2015. 34,000 people ran in that election. I won by 78 votes. And I was at an APS meeting when they finally had finished counting all the votes weeks later. It was a true story. I had my poster. It was the DPP. I have no idea what the poster was on. I was like beaming from here to here because I just won. And someone came up to me to talk about my research. And I said, no, I got to tell you about something else about what just happened to me politically, and they could have cared less. Right? They just want to talk about this. So I went home, and I've been in the legislature, and I go back and forth between these two worlds daily. So Monday, I'll be at the Plasma Lab in the morning. In the afternoon, I'm now the chair of the Science, Innovation, Technology Committee within the General Assembly, and we're doing a hearing on public investment at the state level into innovation. So that's how we got here. And then finally, this is January 12, 2016. You can't tell from here. This is one of the few crowds I'll tell this to, but the book that I'm swearing in on is Volume 1 of Sir Isaac Newton's Principia. Tucked into it is a copy of the United States Constitution, the New Jersey Constitution, and the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. And that's my whole family around me. So, okay. So into this, I'm assuming that if you're here because either you are already doing something in science policy and advising, or you want to. So a couple things. First of all, and we heard this in our last speaker, it's not just about what we know, it's about how we think. And I can tell you now on the politics side that a trained scientist genuinely thinks about problems differently than most people in the political world. And this is, I think, really key. Regardless of what your training is in, what subfield of physics it might be in, the fact that you've trained in science is really critical. Because we're analytical, we break down larger problems into parts. This is what you do by second nature. We're guided by things called data, facts, and evidence to make decisions. I mean, that is what we do. We are open to uncertainty, to probability, and to change. We are quick to learn new topics. I guarantee you, if I said to anyone in this room, I need help on policy around minimum wage, you could do that just as well as you could in condensed matter physics or whatever your subfield may be. We're open to new ideas, and we're skeptical. Right? When you see a conclusion, when you read a paper, you see that conclusion, what's the first thing you do? You start doubting it. You start thinking about all the other possibilities. And you go into a feedback loop that's part of our peer-reviewed process to try to come up with, well, what is the actual conclusion? We put error bars on things. And that, of course, is not something that the rest of the world thinks about, that we think about. And I guarantee you, like I said, we as scientists in this scientific process applied to public policy is critically, critically important. But it's, we're here to say, let's all get involved, but the general public in the United States gives scientists tremendous, tremendous levels of trust. We are considered some of the most prestigious professions in the United States. Doctor, scientist, here's firefighter, the military, engineer, nurse. Look at how many of these are under the STEM umbrella. Right? The general public thinks of us in a way that is very advantageous. We're considered some of the most trusted professions. Again, the medical field is here. And the hardest question I always get is, well, wait a minute, you're a physicist, you're at Princeton, blah, blah, blah. That's, talk to my mom, how proud she is of me. At the least trusted, of course, is, in this case, members of Congress. But why do you want to be a politician? Again, I would say to someone asked this question, for those of you who ever consider running for office, if not us, who? Right? It's a lot to run for office, but if not us, who? More data. Respondents who trust us. This blue means a great deal of trust to some trust. We tell the truth. We conduct researches in the best interest of humanity. We report findings that go against our sponsor of the research. We report them accurately, and we give impartial evidence of matters of public debate. We come with a weight that is listened to if we can get our message across and get our message across effectively. I didn't have this slide until, John, you started talking about the attacks on science. So I have had to now stand in front of large crowds of science-loving people because people have come out for these March for Science, right? Thousands and thousands of people, this is the New Jersey version, have come out. I've had to say the most ridiculous thing now, I think 3 times, which is, I believe in science. Right? It gets a huge cheer. All right? And this crowd, you understand why it's a ridiculous thing to say. But that always gets, I open with that, right? You get a big cheer. I can also tell you that scientists, we are some of the most creative when it comes to sign making, peeps for science. And you can see the peeps. My other favorite one is, if you've been to a protest, you may know the, what do we want? Justice. When do we want it now? We had people do, I don't know if you've heard this one, what do we want? A time machine. When do we want it? That's irrelevant. The other one which didn't work was, what do we want? Peer-reviewed, evidence-based science policy, but that does not flow off the tongue at all. So, but the point is that the general public wants us to be out there and wants to feel that politicians at all levels are being informed by science, which is why they're coming out in mass across the country to counter-protest against the attacks on science. And they've been asked this. So in 2017, they were asked, should scientists engage with elected officials in the public? And the answer, which is in blue, is clearly yes. Should public policy be based upon science? The answer is, again, clearly yes. The need is there, the desire is there, it's up to us to do it. Does evidence-based policy making exist? And both speakers before me have talked about the many factors that go into making a public policy. Sir Peter Gluckman from New Zealand has written and spoken about this extensively. And so this is from something he put together in 2018. But he argues no, that public policy is, there's no way, there's too many factors that go into what makes it. And he points out that for most people, science is not their primary source of evidence. And this is so true. Many of you remember Senator Jim Inhofe was on the floor of the United States Senate with a snowball. And he brought the snowball to say that global warming is not real because it's cold outside. And he threw this snowball to someone off camera. But in his observations, in his day-to-day experience, it's cold. It's cold today outside. And this whole idea of weather versus climate, of observation versus trends, is something that most people definitely struggle with. And so where do you get your information from? Where do you get your conclusions from? Often it can be from traditions that are within your communities, within your background. Religion often informs your particular opinion or perspective. Anecdotes, experiences, observations, and stories, right? I have yet to say to my peers yet, but I've thought about it, that the plural of anecdote is not data, right? But that would not go, you're laughing, right? That would not go over very well. But I can't tell you how many times someone will get up on the floor of the assembly and give an anecdote, or behind closed doors in a caucus room, and give an anecdote and say, this is why I believe blank, because I have one data point of experience. And so now I'm going to inform my entire decision on public policy based upon that experience. And you can't blame them, because back to where I started, we are, as scientists, are trained to think about the world differently. And if your experience is such that it's cold, then you have a hard time thinking about the long-term trend and the warming Earth. And Peter Gluckman, in this paper, had this one. And certainly for most politicians, anecdote and observation are the primary things that influence them. And that's true, because the training of most politicians is in law or is in something else. And what is the training like in law? In law, you have a conclusion. You're hired by someone to get to a certain point. And so you work backwards from your conclusion to come up with what evidence you want to pick to get to that conclusion, to make your persuasive argument. We go the exact opposite way, right? We build up our data, come to that conclusion, and then we question that conclusion. So I'd like to offer up some practical advice on policy making. Since I've now both given it, whether that's effective or not, and then received it. Alan made the joke that I'm my own science policy advisor. I am the Science Caucus in New Jersey, but that's okay. But I have many, many people. I take many meetings over the course of a week or a month on a variety of different topics. So, and some of this has been alluded to, you have to know who you're meeting with and what is driving them. Just because you're the expert on blank, nanotechnology, quantum, it doesn't matter. That's great, but you need to know about them. You need to know about the area they represent. What are their personal agendas? What do you know about them overall? What factors are influential? Understand the economics of your ask. It is not sufficient to simply go, I need more money for blank, right? Whether that is for your research, whether that is for a federal agency, whether that is for something at the local level. The ROI, the return on investment, is really critical. Whenever you go in to talk to a policymaker, you should be talking about jobs that are created. You should be talking about outcomes, whether that is the next cure for cancer or whatever it might be. You should be talking about what is it that is going to benefit that person's district or that state or the country or the world. And you have to do it in a way that is practical. It can't just be the sky is falling, we need money. Because a policymaker, a legislator, myself, is asked daily for, hey, what about, give you non-scientific ones, expansion of pre-K, for instance, funding for nonprofits, charitable work. How do you balance all of these various things? And in politics, where you either live year by year or maybe 2 years by 2 years, but you live by election cycles often, it's very difficult to convince a legislator to take a long-term approach. But if we're going to talk about climate change, of course, we need a long-term approach. You can talk about quantum computing, we need a long-term approach to that same question of how do you survive between different administrations. It takes a lot of various pieces to be able to get the critical mass of policymakers in place so that it will become law and it will survive through administrations. Make your ask early. I'll show you a couple of examples that I think are both done well and that are not done well. I can't tell you how many meetings where I've literally sitting there and I may have been briefed beforehand. Still, I have no idea what the person's talking about, right? And I'm talking technical times too, right? They're just going on, and they're in the weeds, and I have no idea what they're talking about. And I'm just sitting there smiling and nodding and waiting for the ask. If you're there for an ask, tell the person up front, right? Be respectful of the time allotted. I'm trying to do that. And leave a well-designed piece behind, because if you're, for instance, you don't know who you're talking to, at what level they are, are they making the policy? Are they a senior staff member? Are they a junior staff member? Are they an intern? So you want to leave a well-designed piece behind so that there's a takeaway. The other piece of that is, if I have 4 or 5 meetings in a row, boom, 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 they start to blur together, being honest. And so going back to look at the notes and seeing what's going on is really critical. So let me start off by one that is not well designed. That's terrible. Unfortunately, that's related to Department of Energy and fusion energy. Do not read it. I don't expect you to, nor do I expect anybody else read that.
I'm fascinated.
You would be. I'll print it out and give it to you. And continue U.S. leadership in developing fusion energy is sort of a vague, wishy-washy ask to make as well. And so this is not how to make a good ask. Maybe that's back to my first slide where we're still at fusion never. This one's better. This one's a lot better. This is an APS one. It has a nice word there, action. It has something very specific. Lift the cap on discretionary spending in the fiscal year 2020. Ensure sustained and robust funding levels for science. Clearly, the number of words are not there. There is an implication, if the caps are not raised, immediate impacts could include, right? And without even getting into these, you can see, from keeping it very simplistic, that the bars are going downward. It provides a trend, it provides an implication, it gives some details in here, and it has a very specific ask. Right? And this is the type, I'm not saying this is the best, but at least this one is getting to what you need to do. You put this down in front of someone right away, they know what you're asking, and now you can talk them through the details. Right? And then, of course, you end by bringing up the ask again. I want to show you one that's a work in progress because I think it touches on all of these. There's a group of students at Princeton who are working on a carbon fee and dividend. And so rather than just put a straight tax on carbon, this is the idea that we are going to put a fee, don't call it a tax now, put a fee and return the vast majority of that to the stakeholders, to the people. And this has been looked at a federal level, but in the current political climate where that's not in any way feasible, the question is, could we do this at the state level? And so these students have been coming together to work on this, and they gave a presentation to me just a few days ago. But what I wanted to show you was where their thinking is, and as we head towards this, because it touches on all of this. First of all, it has some set of what's the problem. Estimated greenhouse gas emissions from New Jersey over a period of time, what's going on, right? And they break it down by commercial, industrial, residential, transportation, et cetera. The details here aren't important so much as setting the problem. The cost of pollution, air pollution, what's going on, sea level rise around the coast. We're expecting somewhere perhaps as much as close to 500,000 people in New Jersey, we're a coastal state, having to relocate by the end of this century. And pointing out that Hurricane Sandy cost more than $37 billion. That's on order of New Jersey's yearly state budget. Too often asks just end there, right? We have to do something about this. It's costing us enormous amounts of money, so let's spend some money now. But what these students have done is they've addressed what are the issues, what are the economic issues, how can we make this not so hyper-partisan? And so they have also looked carefully at taxes, an out-migration that New Jersey has a significant issue with, a loss of jobs, and the fact that we're ranked the 50th most friendly state for business taxes. That's a very nice way to say we're dead last. All right, so New Jersey is considered the least friendly place to start a business. Yet, of course, businesses and startup businesses are the greatest potential for job growth. So the cost of electricity is critical there, and so they've looked carefully at manufacturing, high-tech manufacturing, and energy-intensive businesses, and how they can create, if they're going to create a proposal around a carbon fee and dividend, how to do it in a way that isn't going to drive energy-intensive businesses out of New Jersey. Yet at the same time, be sensitive to the fact that if there's any increase in the cost of electricity, that our most vulnerable populations in New Jersey will be the most affected. So my point by showing you these, and they're headed towards making a policy brief now, is that they're addressing the problem. They've come up with a solution in terms of the fee and where to put it. And they've looked very carefully at the implications from the business sector, from economic disparity. And then they're meeting with Democrats and Republicans, legislators, people within the administration. Okay, so you've heard a bunch of these before, but there are so many different opportunities and places to provide science advice. Participate in Days of Action. APS has been doing this. I saw when I walked in, writing your, can do everything. Write your member of Congress. That takes you all of 5 minutes to fill that out. But go request a meeting at your local congressional representative at their state office, even if you're just going to meet with their staff, to offer your services. Develop that informal relationship. You have so much you can potentially offer. I can tell you at the state level, there is nothing like a cohort of scientists out there that are able to offer advice. Volunteer for a municipal committee. Most towns have an enormous number of openings, planning committees, environmental committees, tree shade committees, et cetera, where you can get involved in local government at the beginning levels and have an enormous big impact right away. We heard about the Congressional fellowships. Certainly, if you're interested in taking a year off, you should consider applying. And as you heard, about half of the people who get one of these Congressional fellowships tend to stay somewhere within the public policy realm. Something that the next speaker is going to talk about, but I do want to mention briefly, is state-level fellowships. And California has been doing this for a decade, and other states, including New Jersey, are going to start to do this. Same idea as what we see at APS, ACS, AAAS, a paid fellowship for a year for recent PhDs to work in state legislatures with a governor or with a state agency. Where you can, again, get in and do policy advice directly with the policymakers. Many people can then work full-time on policy. There are plenty of places to do so, and if it's something that you're interested in doing, I would strongly urge you to consider that. I do agree that getting laboratory experience is critically important, but if you want to do policy, do it at any time. And then the last one, because I can't help myself, run for public office. We need more scientists. There are President of China, President of Germany, Chancellor of Germany. There are other countries that have a scientist as the top of the government. But we need more PhD level scientists everywhere. Mayors, council members, state legislators, county government, Congress, and someday a president. And so I just want to finish it up with a couple more things. So I won't go into the details because you'll learn more about it in the next talk, but we have started a state fellowship program in New Jersey. It is modeled after the California Fellowship Program, which has been going on for about a decade. We got a small planning grant from the California Council on Science and Technology to put this together. And so I reached out to Rutgers University, our state university, and we have the Eagleton Institute of Politics. And applications are closed. We did get applications, about 40 applications from all over the country. They're closed, but people will be starting this summer. One advantage that we had in terms of this was I put an appropriation directly into the state budget to get this going, and we'll also a second appropriation to run it again for next year. But the 4 fellows will start July of 2019. Oops. And off we go. And so let me end with one of my favorite quotes whenever I'm talking about politics and policy, and it comes from Carl Sagan. In science, it often happens that scientists say, that's a really good argument. My position is mistaken, and then they would actually change their minds, and you never hear that old view from them again. They really do it. It doesn't happen as often as it should because scientists are human, and change is sometimes painful. But it happens every day. I cannot recall the last time something like that happened in politics. And he wrote that in 1987. It's true in 2019 as well. And so I will end by going back onto my soapbox, which is to urge you to please get involved. also to vote and to make sure your colleagues vote. So often scientists, we're talking about getting engaged in public policy, but so often we also hear from our colleagues that they just don't simply vote. And then they don't understand why their budgets were slashed for not being engaged in the political process. People are very disillusioned with the political system that we have right now, and it's up to us to change it. So thank you very much, and of course, happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Thank you. That was great. Hands-on experience is more important than all the fluff we get in Washington, so this has been tremendously helpful. Any questions, comments? Please feel free to use the mic. Where's a rousing response? I would comment from my own experience, having spent a bunch of years at the State Department, that experience is really important. I would, despite some of the opportunities, suggest that you really do finish the postdoc before you take the year off, because you have a lot more credibility. It does matter. That you've done something and screwed it up is important. And in the laboratory, you can't help it. So it's useful to know that those kind of experiences are very important in the political realm. It gives you credibility. And that's something I think people should think about.
Thank you.
Okay.